If I asked you to describe Walter White at first glance, what would you say? High school chemistry teacher. Overqualified, underpaid, awkward, polite, slightly pathetic, a loving father, a stressed husband, a terrified cancer patient just trying to leave something behind. But if I had to sum up the true essence of the character in one word, it wouldn't be teacher, father, or even criminal. It would be predator. Because that's the trick of Walter White. The show sells you a man who looks like prey, then slowly reveals a man who lives for control. And you, as the audience, are in on that secret almost from the very beginning. You watch him pull on a gas mask, strip down to his underwear in the desert, and cook meth with a former student. Right from the first episode, the writers establish that the meek exterior is a lie, that something much darker is operating underneath. But inside the world of the story, almost nobody sees it. For 5 seasons, this man shares meals, classrooms, family barbecues, and dia briefings while building a criminal empire right under everyone's nose. Hank hunts Heisenberg by day and drinks beer with him by night. Skyler sleeps beside him, literally lying next to a lie. Jesse swings between partner, student, and victim without ever fully grasping the scale of the manipulation. How is that possible? The answer and the core thesis of this video is that Walter White's greatest weapon isn't chemistry. It's psychological warfare. His rise from dying teacher to drug kingpin is powered less by methylamine and more by information control. He withholds. He distorts. He weaponizes vulnerability. Every cough, every breakdown, every "I'm doing this for my family" speech becomes another calculated move in a long campaign of manipulation. Think about his early cover stories. The marijuana explanation for Skyler, the fugue state, the gambling addiction. On paper, these lies are ridiculous, yet they work. Why? Because Walt understands motivation. He knows Skyler wants a version of events that keeps her husband recognizable. He knows Hank wants Heisenberg to be a monster out there, not the awkward guy flipping veggie burgers at a family cookout. So he feeds them lies that protect their self-image just as much as they protect him. That brings us to the real question driving this breakdown. In a world full of cops, criminals, and family members who see Walter White every single day, how many people actually suspected him? When do those suspicions first appear? And what stops them, over and over again, from fully landing on the truth? To answer that, we're going to track suspicion like a graph of dread, relationship by relationship, season by season, scene by scene. From Skyler's second phone paranoia to Hank's garage revelation, from Gus quietly assessing Walt's true nature to Jesse finally connecting the dots behind Brock's poisoning, we'll examine exactly who got close, who looked away, and how Walter White managed to keep everyone 2 steps behind until it was far too late. To really answer how many people suspected Walter White, you have to answer a different question first. What is he actually good at? Not chemistry, not cooking, not even violence. His real superpower is manipulation. He doesn't stay invisible because he's weak or harmless. He stays invisible because he's relentlessly, strategically in control of what everyone else thinks they know about him. So in this video, we're going to treat manipulation as the engine of his transformation. If I asked you to list his tools, you'd probably say meth, money, and pride. All true. But if I had to sum up the one mechanism that lets him operate undetected for 5 seasons, it's information control. Every secret, every lie, every staged breakdown is part of a system designed to manage perception. Walt doesn't just cook meth. He cooks narratives. For our purposes, manipulation here means this: the ability to control another person's reality by controlling the information they see, the emotional frame they put it in, and the blind spots they never think to question. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Walt survives by deciding what each character is allowed to notice. Skyler gets the overworked teacher with cancer frame. Hank gets the harmless brother-in-law frame. Jesse gets the failed father figure who needs a partner frame. Same man, different masks. So let's examine suspicion through 3 levels. The first is conscious suspicion, the moment a character feels that something is off, even if they can't name it. Skyler hearing about the second phone. Hank watching Walt throw that match at the barbecue. Jesse realizing the RV is being tracked. Then we'll look at correct suspicion when they actually connect him to drugs or crime, like Skyler hiring a lawyer, or Jesse thinking Walt poisoned Brock. And finally, full recognition, the Hank in the garage level. the "you are Heisenberg" moment where the mask fully breaks. We're going to track those levels across 4 domains of his life, moving chronologically but staying focused on who almost sees him and then looks away. At home, Skylar, Walt Jr., and Marie are trapped by love, habit, and denial. In law enforcement, Hank and the Dia are trapped by bias, paperwork, and the assumption that Heisenberg has to look like a career criminal. In the criminal underworld, Gus, Mike, Saul, and the cartel see his intellect but misread his motivation. Friends, students, colleagues, they barely get past the overqualified teacher stereotype. And underneath that macro arc, we'll zoom in on the micro techniques. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is to break down the specific tools Walt uses. Pure secrecy, lies based on truth, guilt trips, fear, and ego manipulation. For instance, how a single fugue state story can shut down police questions, or how a well-timed hospital breakdown can derail Hank's entire investigation. Scene by scene, we'll see how each tactic keeps suspicion hovering just below the surface, until by the time anyone reaches full recognition, the damage is already irreversible. So if I asked you to imagine living in that house with Walter White, most of you are probably thinking, oh, I'd see it. There's no way a meth kingpin is cooking in my crawl space without me noticing. Ambitious, intelligent, secretive, awkward, stressed, sick, loving. But if I had to sum up the home version of this character in one word, it's plausible. Plausible husband, plausible father, plausible excuses. This is our first analytical domain, the home. The place with the most information about Walt's behavior and, at the exact same time, the thickest emotional filters. Love, obligation, fear, and denial act like a permanent blur effect over every scene. So let's examine what that actually means for suspicion. If you're Skylar, you don't start by asking, is my husband Heisenberg? You start with, is my husband having a midlife crisis? That tiny reframing is all the control Walt needs. Right from the beginning, the writers established that this family already runs on small secrets and white lies. Marie shoplifts. Skylar hides cigarettes during pregnancy. Walt lies about the cancer test results to protect everyone. For instance, when he disappears and invents the fugue state, it's outrageous on paper, but in the moment, it just feels like the next escalation of a man under insane medical and financial pressure. The lie is big, but the motivation is familiar. That's how the show normalizes his early deceptions. The first is basic information control, what he tells them about the cancer, about money, about where he's been. In real life, most families accept missing pieces. You don't track every hour your spouse is away. You don't interrogate every gas receipt. The writers weaponize that social contract. Walt vanishes, comes back, cries, and suddenly the question isn't, what are you hiding? But how can I support you? Inside that environment, his manipulative tools look almost domestic. Secrecy is the lowest rung on the ladder, a second phone, unexplained bruises, late nights. Then selective honesty. Yes, he's scared. Yes, he feels emasculated. Yes, he's ashamed about money. Those confessions are true, and that truth is what sells the larger lie. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is staged vulnerability. The bathroom floor breakdown. The hospital sobbing in front of Hank. The quiet, shaky voice saying, I'm just so lost. Who wants to accuse that man of being a criminal mastermind? If you lived there, would you actually leap to meth empire? Or would you, like Walt Jr., latch on to the more comforting narrative of a heroic, struggling dad? When Skylar finally hires a lawyer and starts talking about something illegal, notice how far along the ladder we already are. Years of rationalization, dozens of red flags, and still the full picture feels almost impossible to say out loud. And Walt isn't done climbing. Because once simple secrecy stops working at home, he has to evolve the same tactics for people who aren't blinded by love, law enforcement, partners, and eventually, predators. So once Walt realizes simple omission can keep Skylar, Hank, and everyone else years behind the truth, he upgrades that instinct into a full-blown strategy. Secrecy stops being an accident or a personality quirk. It becomes his first deliberate tool of control. If I asked you to think about secrecy in your own life, you'd probably land on the harmless version. You don't tell your partner about a pointless argument at work. You round down the price of that new gadget. Those are defensive secrets, You're protecting yourself from conflict, embarrassment, or judgment. The writers take that everyday instinct and hand it to a deeply frustrated, highly intelligent character. Then ask a brutal question. What happens when someone like Walter White decides that same instinct is his right? The first is psychological. Secrecy gives Walt a private laboratory where his new identity can grow, while everyone else keeps relating to the old, gentle chemistry teacher. If I had to sum up his motivation at this stage, it's containment. He desperately wants the thrill, the respect, the power of being Heisenberg, but he also wants breakfast with Walt Jr. to feel exactly the same. By walling off information, he creates two parallel realities and insists both are true. So let's examine his first big secret, the cancer itself. In that early faculty room scene, Walt collapses, gets the diagnosis, and what does he do? He hides it at school, then from Skylar, for as long as he can stand it. On the surface, it looks like shame or fear of worrying his family, and that's part of it. But watch the timing. He tells people only when he can control the scene, the tone, and the fallout. He delays because the moment the truth is out, everyone will start treating him as weak, fragile, dying. By keeping the diagnosis secret, he decides when his own vulnerability becomes public knowledge. That same logic explains why he never tells Hank or Skylar about Jesse. Right from the beginning, the writers establish that Walt's default is to withhold basic connective tissue. Hank knows Walt is a chemistry genius. Hank knows there's blue meth on the street. Skylar knows Walt has a former student who sells him pot. But because Walt refuses to put those pieces in the same room, no one else ever does either. Not telling them about Jesse is a firewall. Even when suspicion flickers, it can't jump across. For instance, think about how much easier Hank's job would be if he knew, from day one, that Walt was hanging around a small-time meth cook from his own classroom. That single fact collapses years of investigation. Walt doesn't need an elaborate lie, he just needs one missing link. And that's the pattern. From the pilot onward, every withheld fact is one less clue that could crystallize into genuine suspicion. People don't accuse him of being Heisenberg because the story they're seeing simply doesn't have that role available yet. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is what happens when these walls start to crack, and Walt has to patch them with something louder than silence, carefully engineered lies that feel truer than the truth. And nowhere do those truer than truth lies land harder than at home, with the one person who actually sleeps next to Heisenberg. Skylar is our test case for how long a smart, attentive partner can live with a criminal mastermind and still not see him clearly. If I asked you to pinpoint her first real suspicion, you might jump to the second phone or the fugue state. But the groundwork is laid way earlier, in that birthday scene in the pilot. On the surface, it's normal. Family, cake, Hank cracking Dia jokes. Underneath, the writers are already corrupting the air. Walt is quiet, withdrawn, mentally elsewhere even before he's diagnosed. Skylar clocks that distance. She doesn't have the information to name it yet, but right from the beginning, the writers establish that her radar is on. Then the red flags start stacking. Late nights, unexplained absences, Walt staring through her rather than at her. So let's examine how she processes that. The first is the familiar box, midlife crisis. Here's a man turning 50, stuck at a car wash, getting humiliated by students. When he suddenly snaps at Bogdan and quits, Skylar reads it as a breakdown, not a business move for a secret meth empire. To the audience, it's a dramatic scene of him seizing control. To her, it's a depressed husband finally exploding. The next lens is the cancer itself. Once that diagnosis drops, Walt gains the most powerful manipulative tool he'll ever have in his marriage, a universal excuse. If I had to sum up his strategy in one phrase, it's weaponized vulnerability. Any strange behavior can now be filed under he's dealing with cancer. Mood swings? Chemo? Vanishing for hours? He needed space. Coldness in bed? He's scared. He's sick. It's a lie by implication, not by speech. For instance, when he comes home late, reeks of chemicals, and collapses on the bathroom floor, Skylar is horrified, but not suspicious in the criminal sense. Her motivation is caregiving, not investigation. She's pregnant, she's running the household, she's Googling treatment options. Her brain is incentivized to protect a stable narrative, because the alternative is that the father of her children is dangerous. Which story would you cling to? That's the quiet brilliance of Walt's control. He doesn't have to fabricate elaborate cover stories yet. He He just lets cancer explain the gaps. He withholds specific information so her suspicion stays vague, a fog of something's off rather than my husband is cooking meth. As long as the questions stay general, his answers can stay general. But there's a limit to how long you can float on atmosphere. Suspicion needs an object, a detail, a prop, and the first time Skylar's discomfort hardens into something sharper, it's not over a barrel in the desert or a bag of cash. It's over something insultingly mundane, a cell phone that shouldn't exist. That tiny piece of plastic is where Walt's old tactics stop being enough, and the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation kicks in. Because once Skylar's suspicion has an actual shape, Walt has to build an entirely new lie around it. Secrecy works when no one is looking too closely. It feels safe, even clever. But if I asked you to live with someone, share a bed with them, and then accept that they keep disappearing with no explanation, how long before silence itself becomes the loudest alarm in the room? That's the ceiling Walt hits with Skylar. At first, his power comes from what he doesn't say. He withholds information about the cancer, about Jesse, about where the money is coming from. Skylar, like most people, fills in the blanks with the most comforting explanation: stressed, sick, overwhelmed. Right from the beginning, the writers established that as long as the questions are vague, Walt can hide behind vagueness. But once Skylar starts asking direct questions, that tactic collapses. Where were you? Who were you with? Do you have a second cell phone? There's no safe way to stay quiet when the question has a yes or no shape. The second cell phone is the pivot. It's not a feeling anymore. It's data. Phone records, late-night calls, Marie's offhand comment, the way Walt clutched his pocket in the hospital. Skylar has a concrete inconsistency that secrecy cannot smother. If he says nothing, he's guilty. If he admits it, he's guilty. So what does a truly manipulative character do when every exit is blocked? He builds a new door. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation isn't hiding the fact. It's redefining what that fact means. Walt can't erase the idea of a second phone, so he has to rewrite the narrative around it. This is where lying stops being a backup plan and becomes his main weapon of control. If I had to sum up Walt's philosophy of lying, it's this: the most effective lies are made out of truth. He doesn't invent wild, unverifiable stories. He takes real information, real emotions, real vulnerabilities, and bends them. For instance, he really does have cancer. He really is humiliated by needing help. He really does feel emasculated next to Gretchen and Elliot's success. The lie is not "I'm fine." The lie is "my shame explains everything you're worried about." And because shame is believable, the audience inside the show does most of the work for him. That's the principle he's about to weaponize against Skylar. Instead of denying her suspicion, he will eventually offer an explanation so emotionally satisfying that it doesn't just close the case, it makes her feel guilty for opening it. You'll see him stage confessions, weaponize tears, and turn a domestic interrogation into a scene where he's the wounded victim and she's the one who pushed too hard. So let's examine one of his most famous domestic lies, where he doesn't merely dodge the second cell phone problem. He transforms Skylar's growing suspicion into sympathy, obligation, and silence. And once you watch how he does it step by step, you start to understand why almost no one in his life ever sees the real Walter White until it's far too late. What makes that second cell phone moment so dangerous for Walt is that it starts with the kind of flimsy lie he normally avoids. A bad lie is disconnected from reality. It's a free-floating story with no anchor points. Anyone can tug on it and the whole thing comes apart. Walt almost slips into that territory when he just denies flatly that there is a second phone. Skylar knows she heard it, the audience knows she's right. That's a weak position, but Walter White doesn't stay weak for long. If I asked you to list his real talents, you'd talk about chemistry, improvisation, pride. If I had to sum up his manipulative genius in this scene, though, it's this: he rapidly upgrades from a flimsy lie to a truth-based lie. He keeps the verifiable facts intact and only swaps out the conclusion. The phone existed. The disappearance happened. The fear was real. All he changes is what those facts are allowed to mean. So let's examine the beat-by-beat breakdown. Skylar confronts him at home, voice shaking, demanding to know where he went and what this second phone is. At first, he stonewalls, doing that quiet, stubborn Walt thing, treating her like she's hysterical and unreasonable. That alone is manipulative. It reframes her perfectly logical suspicion as an emotional overreaction. But he can feel that denial won't hold. The second phone is a hard piece of information. She heard the ring. She has the timeline. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is the pivot. Walt collapses the problem into his cancer. He leans on the real diagnosis, the real terror, the real emasculation he's been stewing in since the pilot. Suddenly the story is not "I wasn't doing anything." It's "I was so overwhelmed that my mind broke." The fugue state lie is brilliant because it's an emotional explanation, not a logistical one. You can't fact-check someone's inner collapse. Watch how he weaponizes what Skylar already knows. She's seen the chemo schedule, the vomiting, the hair loss. She's heard him talk about feeling like less of a man, seen him humiliated at work and at home. When he describes wandering, lost, unable to remember who he is, it doesn't sound like a cover for drug dealing. It sounds like the inevitable breakdown of a fragile, traumatized husband. That's exactly the version of Walt Skylar's motivation wants to protect. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Skylar would much rather believe her husband is sick than that he is dangerous. Walt's lie plugs directly into that preference. He even lets doctors and Hank fill in the gaps, turning the hospital into a stage that validates his story. Once she accepts Walt is psychologically damaged, any future odd behavior can be filed under lingering trauma. Late nights, secretive calls, sudden mood swings, all fallout from the fugue. And that's how this single, well-structured lie doesn't just solve the second phone problem, it future-proofs his double life. The question is, how long can that protective narrative really hold once the bodies and the money start piling up? And that protective narrative only works because Walt isn't just lying, he's weaponizing feelings. The fugue state doesn't just explain his absence, it hands him a new tool, emotional judo. If I asked you to picture a confrontation, you probably imagine the guilty person backing up, stammering, trying to defend themselves. Walter White does the opposite. When Skylar presses, he leans in. He takes her momentum, her concern, her anger, her need for information, and flips it so she's the one off balance. That's emotional judo. He turns being questioned into being attacked. So let's examine the "will you please?" Just once, get off my ass scene, because it's the perfect demonstration. On paper, Skylar is doing exactly what any rational spouse would do. Her husband vanished, claimed a fugue state, has strange phone calls, and now he's talking about going back to work and disappearing again. She's the inquisitor, the one trying to restore control and clarity. But watch how the writers stage that moment. Walt doesn't apologize. He doesn't reassure. He explodes. He reframes her interrogation as cruelty toward a sick man who is fighting for his life. In a single outburst, the roles invert. Skylar, who started the scene as the suspicious one, is suddenly positioned as the unreasonable nag, the character who is pushing too hard, who won't let the cancer patient breathe. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Walt understands something fundamental about guilt. Most people hate feeling like the bad guy more than they hate not knowing the truth. Skylar walks into that scene with logical questions. She walks out with emotional doubt. Is she being unfair? Is she making his illness worse? Has her need for answers crossed a line? If I had to sum up the psychological effect on her in one word, it's disarming. After being blasted like that, she learns a lesson Walt wants her to learn. Push too hard, and you hurt him. The next time she feels that urge to interrogate, to ask about money, late nights, or another secret phone, there's a new barrier. Not just fear of the lie, but fear of being the villain in her own marriage. And this is where it ties directly back to suspicion. By framing her curiosity as cruelty, Walt isn't just dodging one interrogation, he's redesigning the emotional architecture of the relationship. The marriage now orbits around his supposed fragility. Any attempt to investigate him can be recast as an attack on a dying man's dignity. It's manipulative, but incredibly effective. The first time you see it, it feels like a standard marital blow-up. On rewatch, you realize it's the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. Once Walt proves this offensive tactic works on Skylar, why wouldn't he adapt it for everyone else who starts to get too close? Friends, colleagues, even law enforcement. Because when the pressure increases and more people start to suspect Heisenberg, Walt doesn't just defend himself with lies, he starts attacking with emotions, and that's where things get truly dangerous. So once Walt upgrades from defensive lies to emotional attacks, you'd expect Skylar to catch on fast. She's in the house, in the bed, watching every mood swing in real time. But the most disturbing part of her arc is how long the pattern Walt lies, Skylar rationalizes actually holds. Pattern interrupt. Forget the second phone. Forget the fugue state. Jump ahead with me to that car wash office. Skylar standing in front of a literal mountain of cash. Not a stack. A geological formation. If I asked you to explain that away as gambling, could you do it with a straight face? This is the scene where the writers rip the comfort blanket out of her hands. The volume of money is too big for any domestic explanation. It forces her brain out of marriage mode and into crime scene mode. And you see it in what she does next. She doesn't ask for another confession or another tearful speech about providing for the family. She hires a lawyer. She hires a private investigator. That's the structural break. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Skylar's default is emotional processing. Talk it out. Decode his tone. Interpret his motivation. Now she stops treating Walt like a troubled husband and starts treating him like a potential defendant. Information becomes evidence, not reassurance. If I had to sum up this shift, it's the moment she stops asking, "Why are you distant?" and starts asking, "What can be proven?" For instance, when she sits with the lawyer and lists the lies, the secrets, the sudden money, she's building a case file on her own spouse. That's not vague unease anymore, that's an indictment in progress. But the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is that Walt senses this and escalates. We land in the "I'm the one who knocks" era. On paper, that speech should shatter any remaining denial. He is literally declaring himself as the danger. Yet even here, Skylar's suspicion is only halfway upgraded. She now accepts something illegal and he might be dangerous, but she still can't see the full scale of his violence. In her mind, he's bluffing, posturing, amplifying his power to scare her back into line. So let's examine her timeline clearly. Phase 1. Something's wrong. The late nights, the changed personality, the secrets. Phase 2. Something illegal. The gambling story, the car wash money, the lawyers. Phase 3. Much later, he is the danger. When she sees what he's done to Hank and Jesse's world collapses. Walt's manipulative genius is how he stretches each phase to its breaking point, feeding just enough truth to stall the upgrade to the next. And that's the real pattern interrupt for you as an audience member. If the person sharing his pillow takes this long to truly see him, what chance does anyone else have? Who, if anyone, actually beats her to the correct suspicion? Because once we track Skylar's delayed realization, we can start ranking everyone else's, and that list is not what you expect. And if the person sleeping next to him can't see it, what hope does the trained professional have? Because if I asked you to pick the one character who should have nailed Walter White first, you'd probably say Hank Schrader without even thinking. On paper, Hank is the audience's proxy inside law enforcement. He's competent, cocky, and absolutely obsessed with the Heisenberg case. He's the guy with the files, the wiretaps, the task force. The first is simple. He's not a joke cop. He actually does good police work. That's what makes his total blindness to Walt not just tragic, but darkly funny. You're watching a hunter-trade dad jokes with the monster he's hunting, and the monster is the one refilling his beer. Right from the beginning, the writers established this irony. Think about the early RV lab bust. Hank drags Walt along for a ride-along, kicks down the door, brags about how these animals cook, and then later jokes at the barbecue about Walt's mad scientist side. In that scene, the camera literally frames Walt in the background while Hank tells stories about blue meth in the foreground. All the information is there. The chemistry skills, the sudden confidence, the new car, the cash. But Hank files it under my boring brother-in-law instead of primary suspect. Those barbecue scenes are the show's quiet thesis statement. Hank holds court, bragging about chasing Heisenberg, waving tongs like a badge, while Walt stands 3 feet away, smiling and saying almost nothing. It's a visual metaphor for total control. Walt doesn't have to lie actively, he just lets Hank narrate the story for him. So let's examine what has to be true in Hank's head for that to work. If I had to sum up Hank's blind spot in one phrase, it's cognitive bias. He has a mental model of Heisenberg as a street level, probably younger criminal from the world he already knows how to police. Not a middle-aged chemistry teacher with a family, cancer, and a minivan. Every time new evidence appears, he bends it toward that model. A gas mask from Walt's school? Coincidence? An RV connected to Jesse Pinkman? Then, Heisenberg must be some unseen partner, not the mild teacher Hank drinks with. Across 5 seasons, you can count the almost moments. The RV stakeout where Walt and Jesse are trapped inside and Hank gets called away. The hospital parking lot where Walt fakes a breakdown to derail the investigation. The fugue state story Hank openly laughs about, then immediately drops. Each time, Walt weaponizes Hank's loyalty and assumptions, feeding him just enough truth to keep the lie alive. So the key Hank question becomes, what invisible line has to be crossed before he can even consider Walt? The answer is brutal. It takes a physical object that shatters his mental model. Gail's inscription in that bathroom, forcing Hank to rerun every prior scene with new information. And once you see how hard it is for a cop to suspect his own brother-in-law, you can start asking a darker question. What about the people who aren't trained at all? The friends and side characters who never even think to look? And to answer that darker question, you have to start with the one person trained to see patterns, who keeps missing the biggest one in his own backyard. Hank isn't just unlucky, he's the perfect case study in how a strong cop's mind can still be bent by bias, loyalty, and a few well-timed lies. Right from the beginning, the writers established this in that season 1 scene at the White's house, when Hank casually shows Walt and Walt Jr. a bag of blue meth like it's a party trick. Hank cracks jokes, explains the case, and offhandedly mentions the chemistry involved. Walt leans in. You see his eyes lock onto the product. You hear the questions get a little too precise. If I asked you to watch that moment in isolation, you might say, Hank, how do you not clock this? But in context, it reads as exactly what Hank expects. Nerdy teacher curiosity, the harmless science guy asking about molecules. That's the first missed connection. The information is right there. But Hank's model of Walt filters it into something safe. The second comes fast. Hank raids Jesse's pathetic little lab in the desert, drags him out, and then later at the family gathering he riffs on Walt's mad scientist side. He literally calls him the genius, jokes that if Walt ever snapped he'd be dangerous. On paper, this is the scene where suspicion could crystallize. In practice, it turns into a bit. Humor becomes a pressure valve, a way to acknowledge Walt's intelligence without confronting the terrifying implication that this quiet man could actually be Heisenberg. So let's examine the RV investigation. Because if I had to sum up Hank's early arc in one image, it's him circling that rusted bounder. He tracks the mobile lab, gets within inches of the place where Walt cooks, sweats, and transforms himself, and still his focus locks on to Jesse. The criminal is the loud one, the dropout, the guy who fits Hank's mental picture. Walt is the panicked, coughing bystander he can't imagine as a threat. Even when Walt fakes the phone call about Marie's hospital emergency, Hank's brain doesn't go, "Why is this man so desperate to move me?" It goes, "I'm a good husband and brother-in-law. This can wait." This is confirmation bias in action. Hank has already decided what a meth cook looks like, how a kingpin behaves, what kind of man breaks bad. Every time reality hands him a data point that points toward Walt, the chemistry knowledge, the odd absences, the RV, the nervousness his mind files it under coincidence, personality quirk, or family stress. Walt doesn't have to be more manipulative than that. He just has to gently lean on the story Hank already believes. But there's a limit to how much any brain can ignore. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation isn't a shootout or a confession. It's a single mundane object on a toilet tank, a book so ordinary you'd never think it could detonate a life. And when Hank finally reads it, every one of these near misses snaps into a new, horrifying pattern you're not prepared for yet. Hank doesn't walk into a shootout or a confession. He walks into a bathroom. That's the joke of it, and the horror. The monster isn't unmasked in a lab or a desert. He's sitting on a toilet, reaching for something to read. So let's examine that scene. Hank sits down, relaxed, flipping through what looks like harmless bathroom reading, Gail Bowditcher's lab notes. He chuckles at the nerdy poetry, the rambling equations, the strange mix of science and sentiment. The camera doesn't rush. It glides. It lingers on the inscription you already know is coming. To my other favorite, WW. It's an honor working with you. Fondly, GB. And then, everything slows. You watch the information move across Hank's face in real time, like a chemical reaction. If I asked you to freeze frame Hank's expression, you'd see 3 different men at once. The DIA agent, suddenly recognizing a clue. The brother-in-law, suddenly recognizing a name, and the human being, suddenly realizing those two recognitions are the same thing. He repeats the old joke he once made in the lab about WW standing for Walter White. Back then it was a throwaway gag. Now it's a detonator. Why does this work when years of other clues didn't? Because for the first time, Walt's initials are directly, intimately tied to a known meth chemist. In a personal context, Hank cannot rationalize away. No informant rumor, no vague hunch, no sketch of a hat. A gifted chemist writes in his own hand that working with WW is an honor. It's not a lie Walt told Hank. It's a secret Walt never realized would speak for him. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Hank's blind spot wasn't intelligence. It was loyalty and ego. He needed Heisenberg to be an outsider, a stranger he could hunt without emotional cost. This bathroom scene rips that control away. The first is the professional collapse. Every joking remark about Walt's mad scientist side, every time he waved off Skylar's fear, replays as a missed opportunity. The next, deeper collapse is personal. This isn't suspecting a neighbor. This is realizing the man you drink beer with is the architect of your trauma. Pattern interrupt. Notice what Hank does not do. He doesn't shout. He doesn't confront. He staggers out, nearly faints, and sits in the driveway, the world literally spinning. That silence is the sound of cognitive dissonance imploding. If I had to sum up that moment in one word, it's irreversible. Suspicion doesn't climb from 50 to 60%. It jumps from background noise to total certainty in a single cut. And that's why this scene is a narrative snap. All the near misses, all the manipulative breakdowns and car crashes Walt engineered to derail Hank suddenly line up like a timeline of humiliation. For instance, you remember the fake phone call to lure Hank away from the RV, or the staged panic attack to stop the investigation. Now they aren't random obstacles. They're evidence of a long con. Hank is one of the very few characters who ever gets to full conscious suspicion before it's too late. But he's not the first person to feel that Walter White doesn't add up. In fact, long before this toilet revelation, other people were already circling the truth, each blocked by a different emotional bias. And that's where we go next. And the first person circling that truth from the inside isn't a DIA agent or a suspicious spouse. It's the flunked-out kid from chemistry class. Jesse Pinkman is the only character who knows Walter White as both identities at once. Mr. White with the periodic table on the board, and Heisenberg with the gas mask and the ARV. That double exposure gives him unique access to the truth, and a uniquely fragile grip on it. Right from the beginning, the writers established Jesse as the one person who never has to suspect that Walt cooks meth. He's there in the pilot, pants around his ankles, watching his old teacher strip down in the desert and throw phosphine gas at Crazy 8. There's no mystery about what this man is doing. The mystery, for Jesse, is who this man actually is. Is he a desperate cancer patient trying to provide, or a manipulative monster getting high on control? If I asked you to describe Jesse's early perception of Walt, you'd probably say smart, brave, weirdly fearless. But if I had to sum up Jesse's blind spot in one word, it's ruthlessness. He knows Walt is a criminal partner. He doesn't suspect, not yet, that this same teacher will watch Jane die, will push him to kill Gail, will lie about every major turning point in his life. In those first seasons, Jesse genuinely believes they're in this together, two underdogs against the world. The problem is that Jesse doesn't just need a partner, he needs a father. And Walt sees that. So let's examine how that emotional dependence scrambles his suspicion. Every time Jesse's instincts flare up, his need for approval kicks in. When Walt berates his cooking, Jesse folds. When Walt praises him, Jesse lights up like a kid with a gold star. That dynamic turns every red flag into a test of loyalty rather than a warning sign. For instance, look at the way his suspicion comes in spikes and erasures. After Jane's death, Jesse senses that something is off about Walt's behavior in that hospital scene, the way he nudges him toward rehab with a little too much moral clarity. Years later, when he learns the truth, that old half-formed suspicion finally snaps into focus. The writers keep repeating this pattern. Jesse almost sees the full monster. Then Walt closes the narrative loop with a tearful confession, a half-truth or a new crisis that demands Jesse's loyalty. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is the Brock poisoning. In that moment, Jesse's instincts are perfect. He storms into Walt's home with the gun, lays out the ricin theory, and for a few minutes he has the correct information and the correct motivation. He finally suspects the right thing. And then Walt talks him down, weaponizing their shared history, turning Gus into the villain in Jesse's mind. The suspicion is erased. When Jesse later rediscovers the ricin truth, the realization is nuclear. It's not just that Walt poisoned a child. It's that Jesse had solved the puzzle once before and let himself be talked out of it. That's the horror of being the student who knows too much and not enough. You're close enough to see the outlines of the monster, but still emotionally trapped inside his lesson plan. And if Jesse is the most tragic near believer, the next group we have to look at are the ones who never suspect Walt at all, right up until the Empire literally lands on their front lawn. And if the neighbors never see the monster until the Empire falls on their lawn, Jesse is the one person who's standing inside the lab with it and still doesn't recognize the shape. That's not an accident. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Jesse's entire perception of Mr. White is rigged to fail. If I asked you to picture Jesse's face when Walt first pitches the RV idea, you can probably see it. Disbelief, then amusement. To Jesse, this is a clueless chemistry teacher playing gangster, a guy who knows equations, not executions. That first impression is crucial because it means Jesse files Walt under temporary chaos rather than long-term threat. He's worried about arrest, about humiliation, about his parents. He is not yet capable of suspecting deeper malice or some grand, manipulative motivation. So, let's examine how the show starts correcting that illusion. The bathtub body scene is the first, is real fracture. Jesse watches Walt's plan literally melt through the ceiling. The information he gets there is not Walt is evil, it's Walt is reckless and arrogant, but also willing to clean up the mess. Then the Crazy Eight situation escalates that. Walt orders Jesse to help, then locks the man in the basement. Jesse sees the chain, hears the coughing, feels the terror. But when Walt finally kills Crazy Eight, he sells it as a reluctant necessity, and Jesse buys it, because he needs to. Although we see how calculated Walt already is, Jesse tells himself a different story. Mr. White is the one who does the horrible things so they can both live. If I had to sum up that early dynamic in one word, it's absolution. Walt keeps taking the decisive violent step, and Jesse keeps interpreting it as sacrifice rather than control. For instance, look at the Jane tragedy from Jesse's side. He's high, spiraling, clinging to the one person who seems to really see him. Jane relapses, they blackmail Walt, they plan to run. Then, she dies. In that bedroom, Jesse's mind goes straight to the obvious culprits. Heroin, his own weakness, the chaos of addiction. The secret truth, that Walt stood in the room and chose not to save her, is so monstrous it doesn't even occur to him as a possibility. The audience watches a murder by omission. Jesse watches a punishment from the universe. And every time doubt flickers, Walt pays it down like debt. He covers rehab. He vouches for Jesse with Gus. He frames Gail's death as Jesse's necessary sin and his own burden to share. These rescues are not random acts of kindness. They are the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. By saving Jesse from consequences, Walt makes Jesse question his own suspicions. Who suspects the man who keeps pulling you out of the fire? But there is a limit to how long you can hide behind that mask, especially when children start getting hurt. The first time Jesse truly, consciously wonders if Mr. White is capable of monstrous calculation, it's over a kid's life, and even then, Walt has one more story ready, one more lie to turn that suspicion back on itself. So when Brock collapses, that mask you've been watching for seasons finally slips for Jesse. The writers don't play it vague. They let his brain do exactly what your brain does on the rewatch, run the list of who had the poison, who had the access, who had the motivation. The first is the missing ricin cigarette. Jesse realizes it's gone, connects it to Brock's sudden, mysterious illness, and you can see the information slam into him in real time. He knows Walt handled his smokes. He knows Walt needed Gus dead. If I asked you to map out suspects, there is only one person who benefits from Jesse believing Gus would hurt a child. His mind jumps straight to Mr. White, and for one terrifying second, he is right on target. So let's examine that confrontation, because it's one of the purest X-rays of Walt's manipulative core. Jesse storms into the lab, gun shaking, screaming, pressing the barrel into Walt's face. This is not subtle doubt. This is a character finally saying out loud what the audience has been whispering. You did this. And what does Walt do? He does not fight the emotion. He weaponizes it. Watch the pivot. In a single scene, Walt goes from potential child poisoner to trembling victim. He doesn't beg for his life in a straightforward way. He redirects the entire narrative. He accuses Gus of engineering the poisoning, of stealing the ricin, of turning Jesse against him. He leans into Jesse's existing mental model of Gus as the ultimate evil, the man who ordered a kid on a bike executed. If I had to sum up Walt's tactic here in one word, it's redirection. And here's the genius. He doesn't say, "You're wrong to be angry." He says, "You're angry at the wrong man." That tiny distinction is the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. He validates Jesse's rage so it feels truthful, then rotates the target a few degrees until it lands on Gus. For instance, when he offers himself up, pushes the gun into his own forehead, it plays like self-sacrifice. But it's also a dare. If you shoot me, you're killing the only person who really cares about you. Then, Walt reinforces the illusion with structure. The fake confession video about Hank shows Jesse how far Walt will go to frame someone else and protect family. The later hospital explanation that Brock was poisoned by Lily of the Valley, not ricin, seems to scientifically clear Walt. The audience knows better, but Jesse's brief flash of clarity is buried under medical jargon, staged evidence, and the relief of having a different monster to blame. This is suspicion as surgery. Jesse glimpses the full monster, then Walt reaches into his mind and rearranges the evidence until Jesse doubts his own eyes. And once you've doubted yourself that deeply over a child's life, what are you willing to question next? In the following phase of their relationship, that self-doubt becomes Walt's most reliable weapon. And that brings us to the one man who sees the monster and immediately tries to put it on retainer. If I asked you to name the first character who correctly files Walter White under serious criminal instead of sad dad with a secret, you're probably thinking of Hank or Skyler. But if I had to sum up the answer in one word, it's Saul. Saul Goodman is the first person who looks at Walt and doesn't flinch at the meth, the violence, the bodies in the desert. He clocks the double life instantly. High school chemistry teacher on paper, Heisenberg in practice. Right from the beginning, the writers established this with their introduction. Saul meets Walt and Jesse after they kidnap him, drag him into a grave, and threaten to kill him. Most lawyers would panic. Saul starts negotiating. In that scene, he's already categorizing Walt with almost clinical precision. He realizes this is not just Mr. White, the harmless client. This is the cook, the source, the rare asset. And crucially, he assumes that makes Walt manageable, profitable, containable. So let's examine that miscalculation. Saul's initial suspicion is sharp, but narrow. He pegs Walt as smart, careful, and desperate for control, but he still thinks in terms of clients and leverage. To Saul, information is currency and legal tricks are weapons. He believes if he controls the paper trail, the shell companies, the fake car wash narrative, then he controls Walt. For instance, when he pushes Walt toward money laundering and suggests using Jesse as a silent partner, he's treating a drug empire like a tax problem. The first is Saul's worldview. In his mind, everyone is dirty, everyone is scared, and everyone ultimately wants the same thing, to get paid and stay out of prison. That belief blinds him. He underestimates Walt's capacity for escalation because he assumes Walt shares his basic motivation for survival. Saul doesn't factor in ego, legacy, or the thrill of domination as primary drives. To him, those are just colorful quirks on an otherwise predictable client. But the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is when Saul starts to sense that Walt is not staying in the box he built. You see it in the "I know a guy who knows a guy" speech about the disappearer. Saul is suddenly talking about permanent vanishing, new identities, burning everything down. That's not standard issue tax evasion. That's a man recognizing that his client might drag him into a point of no return. And yet, even then, he doesn't fully suspect the scope. He warns Walt, he jokes, he flinches at the idea of killing Jesse, but he never truly believes Walt will turn that nuclear option on him. He sees the criminal role, not the black hole of ego at the center. That partial suspicion is crucial, because as the stakes rise, Saul's blind spot becomes the audience's question. If even the crooked lawyer underestimates Walt, what chance does anyone else have in the system that's supposed to stop him? Saul underestimates Walt because he thinks in scams and plea deals. Gus and Mike underestimate him for a much scarier reason. They're professionals, and they still misread the wild card. If I asked you to list the characters with the sharpest radar for danger, You'd say Gus Fring and Mike Ehrmantraut without hesitation. Calm, clinical, always scanning for threats. Their entire survival strategy is built on reading people correctly. Right from the beginning, the writers established Gus as someone who never moves without information. He watches, he tests, he lets other people talk. When he meets Walt at Los Pollos Hermanos, you can see him clocking every detail, the desperation, the intelligence, the pride. He doesn't just see a cook, he sees a man who resents being managed. That's why Gus keeps a polite distance, why he uses intermediaries, why he refuses to eat the food Walt brings. He already suspects that this is not an employee, this is a potential rival. If I had to sum up Gus's read on Walt, it's this: valuable, but volatile. For instance, when Walt kills the two dealers in the street after Jesse's breakdown, Gus doesn't act surprised that Walt crossed a line. He acts annoyed that Walt did it publicly. The problem isn't the murder, it's the lack of control. Gus immediately moves to replace him with Gale, not because he doubts Walt's capabilities, but because he understands those capabilities are attached to an ego he can't fully domesticate. Mike's suspicion runs on a different frequency. Where Gus sees strategy, Mike sees temperament. The first is his instinctive dislike. In their early scenes, Mike keeps calling Walt a time bomb, a ticking disaster, warning Saul, warning Jesse, warning anyone who will listen that Walt is too emotional and too unpredictable. He's not impressed by the chemistry lectures. He's focused on the outbursts, the improvised lies, the way Walt drags everyone into chaos to keep control. So let's examine the gap between what they suspect and what they miss. Both men correctly identify that Walt will lie, that he will betray, that he will push back against authority. They anticipate disobedience. They even anticipate murder as a tool. What they don't anticipate is extremity. A suicide-adjacent nursing home bombing, wired to a bell on a wheelchair to take out a cartel boss in front of a framed family photo? That's not just criminal thinking. That's theatrical annihilation. And that's their blind spot. Gus assumes Walt values his own continued comfort too much to risk a mutually assured destruction scenario. Mike assumes Walt will always pick the self-preserving lie over the self-immolating gesture. Both of them think there is a line he won't cross, a floor of basic self-interest that will keep him predictable. The irony is brutal. These two see more of Walt's true capabilities than Skyler, than Hank, than Walt Jr. They know he's dangerous long before the family does. Yet they still share the same fatal assumption as everyone else, that at the end of the day, Walter White wants to live. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is asking what happens when a man's need for control outweighs his instinct for survival, and who, if anyone, can see that coming in time. And who, if anyone, can see that coming in time. Because once you step outside the family circle, you get a different kind of blindness, enemies who fear the legend, but don't really see the man. If I asked you to describe how the cartel views Heisenberg, you'd probably picture rage, arrogance, territorial pride. All true. But if I had to sum up their actual suspicion in one word, it would be abstract. Right from the beginning, the writers established that, to the cartel, Heisenberg is an annoying rumor in the supply chain, a talented cook encroaching on their territory, not a fully realized mastermind. They think in terms of percentages, territory, purity. Who is this chemist Gus is using? Is an information problem, not an existential one. So let's examine how that plays out on screen. When they send the cousins, their motivation isn't Walter White must die because he's a brilliant strategist. It's simple blood for blood. They never sit down and analyze his manipulative control over Jesse, his lies to Skyler, his secret double life. To them, he's a pawn Gus moved onto the board. Even when they finally see him, that iconic scene where Walt is crawling, broken, in the desert before Hank arrives, they don't think, this is the architect of our downfall. They think, this is the weak link we can cut. The neo-Nazis later make the same mistake, just with more tattoos and better access to his bank barrels. Jack and his crew recognize two things, Walt's product and Walt's money. For instance, when Walt hires them to take out 10 witnesses in prison, they clock that he has serious reach. But even then, they treat him as a resource to exploit, not a threat to fear. Once he's handcuffed in the dirt in Ozymandias, coughing and begging, they assume the game is over. Who would still be dangerous from that position? And that's the point. These distant enemies never suspect the true long game. They don't imagine that the same man who built an empire out of a high school lab could engineer a trunk-mounted machine gun massacre from apparent defeat. Their suspicion is aimed at the myth, not the person. Heisenberg is a name on a barrel, a blue product in a bag, not the frail man in glasses who looks like he should be grading chemistry quizzes. This is the opposite problem of the family. Skylar and Walt Jr. know the man and resist the myth. The cartel and Jack's crew fear the myth and ignore the man. Both sides are working with incomplete information, and Walt exploits that gap perfectly. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is seeing how he weaponizes that split identity, Heisenberg versus Walter White, until even the audience has to ask which one is really in control. And if that split identity is Walt's greatest weapon, Marie and Walt Jr. are the perfect demonstration of how love can make that weapon invisible. If I asked you to point to the family members who should have known, a lot of people jump straight to Skylar and Hank. But if I had to sum up Marie and Walt Jr.'s role in one word, it would be insulation. Their affection doesn't just protect Walt, it actively repels suspicion. So let's examine Marie first, because she's a fascinating paradox. She is, in many ways, hypersensitive to secrets. Right from the beginning, the writers established her as someone who can smell that something is off with Skylar. She clocks the weirdness around the second cell phone, the evasive answers, the sudden influx of money. She's the one pushing. Is there gambling? Is there money laundering? Is there an affair? She's circling the truth. But crucially, her mental model of the family has a hard limit. Skylar can be hiding something. Walt can be sick, depressed, distant. But Walt as a manipulative drug kingpin? That never becomes a serious hypothesis. That blind spot isn't random. It's tied to Marie's own issues. This is a character who literally steals things she doesn't need, lies about it, then folds into denial when confronted. She understands secrecy and shame on an instinctive level, which should make her more dangerous. Instead, it makes her complicit. For instance, when Skylar hints at something illegal with Walt's money, Marie's reaction is outrage and moral disgust, but also a refusal to really interrogate what that something is. If she looks too closely at Skylar and Walt's dysfunction, she has to look at her own. It's easier to keep the family script intact. Hank the hero, Walt the mild brother-in-law, Skylar the one who made bad choices. Walt Jr., on the other hand, almost never even gets to the edge of suspicion. His entire emotional arc is built on idolizing Dad, especially after the cancer diagnosis. Walt's vulnerability gives him enormous control here. The first is pity. Walt Jr. sees a sick, humiliated man fighting to provide. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is turning that pity into loyalty so strong it shuts down doubt. When Skylar tries to warn him, when fragments of truth leak out, he doesn't weigh the information, he defends the image. Look at the pool incident. Skylar walks into the deep end as a cry for help, a desperate attempt to break the narrative. In the aftermath, Walt Jr. sides with his father, not because he has evidence, but because his motivation is to preserve the good dad, unstable mom story he understands. His loyalty becomes a shield. If Dad is the victim, he can't be dangerous. Even when he later learns pieces of the truth, he clings to whichever version of Walt feels least threatening. Together, Marie and Walt Jr. show you what it looks like when suspicion never fully activates. Their family roles are so rigid that reality bends to fit them, not the other way around. And if Walt can hide this effectively from the people who love him most, what does that say about the people who are actually trained to catch monsters like him? And that brings you to the real magic trick. It's not just the characters who underestimate Walt. The show makes sure you do too. Breaking Bad is constantly playing a double game, managing the suspicion inside the story and the suspicion in your head at the same time. Right from the beginning, the writers established a simple but brutal hierarchy of information. You know more than Hank, more than Skylar, more than Marie, but you never know everything. You see Walt in the RV, you hear the name Heisenberg, you watch him let Jane die, and you feel superior because the secret is solved. But then Hank barbecues with him for years, trading jokes about mad scientists, and somehow you're still shocked when the book on the toilet finally flips the switch. If I asked you to list the times you screamed at the screen, they all come from this alignment game. When Skylar smells the second phone, when she hears about the fugue state, when she hires a lawyer and even a pie because the story no longer fits. The writers keep cutting between her half-formed suspicions and your near omniscience, so you're trapped in this constant tension between it's obvious and apparently it isn't. So let's examine how they keep that tension alive. The first is the decoy explanation. Cancer stress, midlife crisis, financial pressure, gambling addiction. Each one is a clean, emotionally satisfying label that a character can grab instead of the truth. For instance, when Walt comes home after killing Crazy 8 and collapses on the bathroom floor, the show lets Skylar file it under health and marriage problems. The audience knows there's a body in a basement and a chain around a neck. But the domestic framing is so strong, you still feel like you're watching a sad husband, not a budding killer. This is where cognitive bias becomes the writer's favorite tool. Normalcy bias says, suburban chemistry teachers don't run meth empires. Confirmation bias tells Hank that Heisenberg must look like the criminals he already hates, not the brother-in-law he pities. The halo effect wraps Walt in his roles as father, provider, patient, and makes every lie feel like a tragic exception instead of a pattern of control. The show doesn't lecture you about any of this. It just builds scene after scene where the easier story wins. And here's the pattern interrupt. Instead of asking, why didn't they suspect him sooner? Flip it. Ask, what did Walt do, specifically, to make suspicion feel impossible? Because once you look at it that way, you're not blaming Hank or Skylar for being blind. You're studying how a highly manipulative man weaponizes every bias, every decoy, every half-truth to close their mental loops before they can ever fully open. Next, we'll break down those tactics one by one and see exactly how he engineers that invisibility. So if you zoom in on how he does that, you hit one of the core mechanics of the whole show: information as currency. In Walter White's world, every fact about him is either a weapon someone can use against him or a tool he can use to control them. There is no neutral detail. If I asked you to point to his real stash, it's not just the money in the barrels, it's the secrets in his head. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Walt treats knowledge like a limited edition product. He never lets any one character buy the full set. Skylar gets the cancer patient, struggling provider, gambling problem narrative. Hank gets mild-mannered brother-in-law who needs a ride-along story to feel manly. Jesse gets desperate teacher who can cook like a genius but needs protection. Saul gets client who is valuable but supposedly manageable. Each of them holds a different shard, and Walt is the only one who sees the whole mirror. So let's examine how carefully that's mapped. The first is Skylar. For most of the series, she knows nothing about specific crimes. She knows about money, about danger in the abstract, about the business, but not about Jane, not about Brock, not about Gale. When she finally learns he cooks meth, Walt immediately floods her with a prepackaged narrative. He did it for the family. He's already quitting. The money is already there. He gives her just enough information to make further questions feel disloyal. Hank is the inverse. He knows every detail of Heisenberg's operation on paper, but not the one crucial link, Jesse. Walt keeps his worlds separate. Hank doesn't know about the RV Cook partnership, doesn't know that the junkie he roughs up is his own brother-in-law's student. That compartmentalization means Hank's mental picture of Heisenberg never quite overlaps with the Walt he barbecues with. Jesse, meanwhile, knows about the labs, the cooks, the bodies in the desert, but he doesn't know about the family finances, the car wash, the storage unit, or the phone calls to Walt Jr. He has no access to the dad persona, which is why Walt can sell him on being a necessary father figure without Jesse ever fully suspecting how replaceable he is. Watch how often Walt deliberately withholds one key detail to stop anyone from reaching critical mass. He never tells Jesse about his role in Jane's death, because that would instantly reframe every tender speech as predatory. He doesn't tell Skylar that he orchestrated Brock's poisoning, because that would connect my husband cooks meth to my husband endangers children as a tactic. Even with Saul and Gus, he lies by omission, hiding the full extent of his ego and long-term motivation. If I had to sum up the effect, it's that suspicion gets fragmented. Each person has a puzzle, but Walt is rationing the pieces. Skylar suspects a criminal, Hank suspects a mastermind, Jesse suspects a manipulative partner, but no one, until very late, is allowed to hold all those suspicions at once. That's why most people never fully suspect Walter White. The information is rigged before they ever start to think. And the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is seeing what he does when those compartments finally start to leak, and the walls between his worlds begin to crack. And when those walls start to crack, Walt doesn't just patch them with new lies. He upgrades the whole system. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is guilt. not his guilt. Yours. If I had to sum up this tactic, it's simple but brutal. Guilt manipulation is when you convince someone that their anger, their doubt, their very suspicion of you is actually proof that they're the bad person. Their moral failure becomes the story, not your crime. So let's examine how Walter White turns other people's consciences into his personal security system. Skylar is the cleanest example, because right from the beginning the writers established her as sharp, concerned, a little controlling, but fundamentally caring. When she questions Walt about the second phone, he doesn't just deny it. He reframes her concern as nagging. She's on his back. She's stressing out a cancer patient. She's making a hard time even harder. The information she's chasing is real. But the more she chases it, the more he implies she's the problem. When she gets scared enough to leave, he escalates. Suddenly, her attempt to protect herself and the kids becomes a betrayal of the family. The scene where she tells him she's afraid of what he's done is quietly horrifying, because his response is not, "I understand why you're scared." It's, in effect, "How could you think that of me after everything I'm going through?" If I asked you to point to a moment where Skylar stops trusting her own instincts, this is one of them. She starts to feel guilty for even suspecting him, which is exactly what he wants. With Jesse, guilt is less about respectability and more about self-loathing. Walt knows Jesse's pressure points, Jane's death, his addiction, the kid in the street. For instance, every time Jesse's intuition edges toward the truth about Walt's influence, Walt steers the conversation back to Jesse's own failures. He's the junkie, he's the one who chose to use, he's the one who got Jane high. Walt wraps himself in the role of disappointed father figure, the one who tried to help, so that Jesse's rage boomerangs inward instead of outward. That's why the Brock poisoning arc lands so hard. Jesse's first instinct is right. Then it collapses under Walt's performance of wounded innocence and righteous hurt. Questioning Walt becomes one more thing to hate himself for. You see the same rewrite play out in the pool scene and the classic "I did this for the family" posture. Walt's breakdown in the water, his later speeches about sacrifice, are all attempts to overwrite everyone else's moral judgment with his own narrative of victimhood and necessity. If he can make Skylar, Walt Jr., even Hank feel cruel for condemning him, then their suspicion has to pass through a wall of self-reproach before it ever reaches him. And that's the real trick. Guilt doesn't just block suspicion of Walt, it redirects it inward so the characters start suspecting themselves instead. But what happens when someone finally refuses to carry his guilt for him? When someone stops blaming themselves and starts blaming you, there are only two ways to shut that down: win them back, or scare them silent. And by the late game, Walter White has lost the first option. All he has left is fear. If I asked you to describe early series Walt, you'd probably talk about secrecy and pity. The sad chemistry teacher with cancer, the overqualified car wash worker, the man who lies badly and cries in the shower. Right from the beginning, the writers established that his manipulative power comes from being underestimated. He hides behind weakness, but the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is when he doesn't need to be pitied anymore. He needs to be obeyed. So let's examine that shift. Early on, people don't confront Walt because they feel guilty or confused. By the Heisenberg era, they don't confront him because they're afraid. It's no longer a question of information, of who knows what secret. It's a question of survival. Can you even say what you suspect without triggering something you can't control? Skylar is the clearest turning point. When she stands in the kitchen and says, "I'm afraid of you," she's not delivering a legal verdict. She's confessing a psychological reality. She doesn't have a full case file on every body Walt is responsible for, but she has enough scattered scenes in her head: the money pile in the storage unit, the phone calls, the dead-eyed calm to understand his motivation has crossed a line. And that fear becomes its own prison. She launders the money. She stays in the house, not because the lie still works, but because confronting the truth feels physically dangerous. If I had to sum up Saul Goodman's late series behavior in one word, it's self-preservation. For instance, compare his early, breezy jokes about sending you to Belize with the strained, almost panicked way he urges Walt to take the vacuum cleaner exit later. The humor is still there, but the energy is different. He's reading Walt's volatility, the way this character now exerts control with sheer menace. Saul suspects enough the bodies that follow Walt, the way Mike disappears to know that pushing too hard could make him the next loose end. And then there's Jesse in the final phase before captivity. He doesn't just suspect Walt of isolated lies, he starts to see a pattern. Jane's death, Brock's poisoning, the way every tragedy somehow consolidates Walt's position. When he tries to act on that realization, attacking Walt in the street, teaming up with Hank, the response isn't debate. It's overwhelming force. Gaslighting gives way to handcuffs, to Nazi enforcers, to a chain on his ankle. At this stage, the real question isn't do they suspect Walter White, it's are they allowed to say it out loud without risking their lives. And once suspicion itself becomes dangerous speech, you have to ask, who's left that can still speak freely around him at all? Once suspicion itself becomes dangerous, you'd think the game is over, but Walter White has one more shield. And it's not a gun or a lie. It's your ego. If I asked you to name the most underrated weapon in his arsenal, you might say chemistry, that infamous blue product, the ricin. But if I had to sum up his real edge in one word, it's flattery. Ego manipulation is simple in theory. Praise someone's intelligence or power so they feel less threatened, then watch as they voluntarily underestimate you. Walt turns this into an art form. He doesn't just hide information, he massages the other person's self-image until the idea that he could be their equal feels absurd. The suspicion doesn't die because of evidence, it dies because of pride. So let's examine his dynamic with Gus. On paper, this is the one man who should never be fooled. Hyper-controlled, clinically intelligent, surrounded by surveillance and killers. Yet Walt walks right past all that, not by outmuscling Gus, but by feeding his empire builder fantasy. He plays the grateful employee, the humble cook who says, in every scene, you're the visionary, I'm just the technician. Right from the beginning, the writers established this in the lab tour. Walt is wide-eyed, deferential, impressed by the operation. For instance, when Gus criticizes his emotional decisions, Walt doesn't argue his own brilliance. He accepts the lecture, reinforcing Gus's belief that he's the only true strategist. That's the trap. If Gus allows himself to see Walt as merely an asset, then the possibility that this asset is plotting regicide never fully lands until it's too late. With Hank, the strategy looks lighter, almost like a running joke. Walt constantly feeds Hank's bravado. He plays the nervous schoolteacher, the man who isn't cut out for danger, the guy who can barely hold a gun without flinching. When Hank tells his war stories, Walt laughs, defers, lets Hank be the alpha in the room. The audience knows Hank is literally hunting Heisenberg while grilling burgers with him. But Walt's self-deprecating performance turns the idea of Walt as a cartel-level criminal into something Hank can only process as a punchline. How do you suspect a man you've spent years patronizing? The same pattern shows up with Saul and Mike. Walt lets them believe they're the seasoned pros, and he's the desperate amateur. Saul calls him the chemistry teacher like an insult. Walt doesn't correct him. Mike treats him as a volatile client, not a rival. That delay, that assumption of superiority, is the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. By the time they realize he's trying to outmaneuver them, he already has leverage over both. And this is the deeper point. Suspicion isn't just about clues on a board. It's about whether your ego will even allow you to imagine that the person you've dismissed could be smarter, colder, or more ambitious than you. So who, if anyone, ever manages to look past their own pride and see Walt clearly? To answer that, you need to do something uncomfortable, strip him of his main character armor and throw him back into season 1 as just another guy at Hank's barbecue. If I asked you to re-watch that pilot in your head, but this time pretend you don't know Walter White is the protagonist, what do you actually see? You see Hank holding court, loud and confident, Dia vest on, beer in hand. You see Marie cracking jokes. You see Walt Jr. rolling his eyes. And then, in the background, there's this quiet, polite, slightly pathetic chemistry teacher flipping veggie burgers. If I had to sum up how the camera initially frames him, it's simple, harmless. But now run that same scene with the information you have from all 5 seasons. Right from the beginning, the writers established 3 things about Walt that would scream potential danger if he were anyone else. The first is his absurd level of chemistry expertise. The second is his financial desperation. The third is that quiet, simmering resentment when Hank waves that stack of drug money on TV and jokes about easy cash. You can feel Walt's ego fracture in real time, but the other characters just laugh and move on. So let's examine how your own bias as an audience member mirrors theirs. You forgive those red flags. because you've already accepted Walt as the man you're supposed to root for. You read his humiliation at the car wash as tragic, not as motivation. You watch him get mocked at school and think, poor guy, instead of, this man has both the knowledge and the incentive to do something extreme. The show is manipulative on purpose here. It trains you to underestimate him. Pattern interrupt. Pause the story in your mind. Take the scene where he blows up the bully's car in the school parking lot. Freeze frame right before the explosion and ask yourself, if this mild, underpaid teacher vanished for a few hours today, what story would you believe about where he went? Car trouble? Extra grading? A doctor's appointment? You would build the same comforting lie Hank and Skylar build, because that's what normal people do when nothing about a person seems dangerous. Do the same with the school lab demonstration where Walt launches into that intense monologue about chemistry being the study of change. In hindsight, it's a manifesto. In the moment, everyone treats it as a quirky teacher speech. Or think about the car wash humiliation, Bogdan barking orders, Walt silently swallowing it. If he disappeared right after that scene, would anyone jump to meth kingpin, or would they assume depression, a breakdown, maybe an affair? This is the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation the show climbs with you. It doesn't just show characters failing to suspect Walt, it conditions you to find their lack of suspicion reasonable. The more you accept him as harmless in season 1, the easier it is to see how you, in their position, would make the exact same mistakes. And that raises a harder question. When someone in your own life quietly checks all those boxes, would you really see them any more clearly than Hank or Skylar did? So if I asked you to name the people who really saw Walter White, you'd probably say Skylar, Hank, Jesse, the inner circle. But if I had to sum up the brutal truth, it's this. Even they spend most of the show being wrong about him. So let's examine this systematically and give ourselves a rough suspicion scale. 0 is total comfort, no suspicion at all. 1 is that vague unease, you feel something is off, but you can't attach a clear criminal motivation. 2 is accurate suspicion of serious criminality, even if you don't know the details. And 3 is the holy grail, full recognition that Walt is Heisenberg. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Skylar is the first real test case. In season 1, she hovers between 0 and 1. The missing hours, the late-night phone calls, the fugue state, she's uneasy, but she buys the cancer stress explanation. She smells a secret, not a meth empire. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation comes in early season 2, when she finds the second phone and walks out of Walt's intervention. That's her jump to level 1 in a big way. She knows he's lying. She just mislabels the lie as an affair. Season 3 is where she hits level 2. When she confronts him after talking to Saul's receptionist and hearing the word criminal lawyer, the information finally lines up. She doesn't yet say Heisenberg, but she explicitly links him to something illegal and large-scale. By Caballo sin nombre, when she demands a divorce, she's operating with a correct sense of his criminality, even as Walt keeps trying to reframe it as noble sacrifice. Level 3 for Skylar lands in that garage scene with the pile of money. Once she sees the literal mountain of cash and hears him say, "I'm in the empire business, any ambiguity dies," she knows who he is. Hank's curve is slower and crueler. For years, he's stuck at 0 with Walt specifically, even as he's at 2 with the abstract figure of Heisenberg. He jokes about mad scientist Walt in season 1, but it's banter, not suspicion. During the RV investigation in season 3, he brushes level 2 with Walt without realizing it. The RV is linked to Jesse. Jesse is linked to Walt. Yet Hank's biases push him away from the obvious. Walt weaponizes that by faking the hospital call, yanking Hank back to emotional 0. Hank only slams into level 3 in the bathroom with Gail's book. One inscription, all the information reframed, and suddenly every barbecue flashback becomes evidence. Jesse's line is jagged. He lives at 1 with Walt for most of their partnership. He knows Walt lies. He feels controlled. But he still sees him as a twisted father figure. Around Brock's poisoning in season 4, Jesse spikes to level 2, even 3 for a moment, when he shoves the gun in Walt's face and accuses him directly. Then Walt's manipulative performance, the who benefits. Logic. The fake outrage drags him back down. It's not until season 5, when he realizes the rice and cigarette was staged and learns the truth about Jane, that Jesse hits permanent level 3. From that point on, he doesn't just suspect Walt is Heisenberg, he understands that Walt is willing to destroy children and lovers to maintain control. And that's the pattern you start to see. Reaching level 3 is rare, and in this universe, it's almost a death sentence. In the next section, we'll tally who else ever gets that far, and how quickly the story removes them once they do. But for every character who reaches that lethal level 3, there's a whole cloud of people who never even get on the board. They orbit Walter White, they feel the turbulence, but they never see the engine. And if I asked you to list who really knew Walt, you probably wouldn't even remember half of these faces. So let's examine the ones who live in his shadow without ever understanding what's casting it. The first is Bogdan, Walt's old boss at the car wash. Right from the beginning, the writers established this petty, controlling manager who sees Walt as a meek, overqualified employee. When Walt returns to buy the place, Bogdan experiences a sudden power reversal, a strange surge of confidence from a man he used to bully. He notices the attitude shift, the cash, the weird insistence on the laser tag cover story. But what does he file it under? Midlife crisis. Lottery win. Not this man is laundering meth money. His information is too limited for any more sinister interpretation. Then you have Ted Beneke. Ted is fascinating because he actually does suspect something, just in the wrong direction. He sees Skylar cooking the books, he hears the flimsy explanations, he feels the danger when the ears closes in. He knows there's a lie. He senses criminal motivation. But his mental model stops at Skylar is protecting the family business, or someone is helping her fudge numbers. It never stretches to her mild chemistry teacher husband is a drug lord funding this bailout. Even when the money appears in absurd amounts, Ted assumes anonymous benefactors, not the man who awkwardly chatted with him at a birthday party. Walt's invisibility cloak works so well that Ted can be inches from the truth and still miss the actual source of control and danger. Look at Walt's students. For instance, the kid who watches his teacher suddenly quit, come back, ramble about chemistry as the study of change, and then blow up at a paper towel dispenser. They see stress, illness, a teacher going through something. They don't have access to the secret phone calls, the desert meetings, the blue product. So their brains do what most brains do. They choose the smallest, most domestic explanation possible. The neighbors are the same story, just with better sightlines. During the infamous pizza on the roof scene, they see a husband melting down in the driveway. Later, when Walt moves back in and the party spills into the pool, or when Carol drops her groceries at the sight of him after his disappearance, the neighborhood reads it as domestic chaos, marital drama, a man with a mysterious scandal. No one jumps to Heisenberg. Why would they? The scenes are shot from across the street for a reason. The audience gets to feel how ordinary it all looks from 30 yards away. If I had to sum up what these collateral characters represent, it's the broader world's default setting. Most people you meet who act off, who suddenly have money, who seem more aggressive or secretive than before. You label them weird, burned out, in trouble. You do not leap to cartel connections. And that's the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. Walt doesn't just control those closest to him. He relies on everyone else to be unimaginative. The unsettling implication is simple. A Heisenberg could live on your block, work in your office, teach your kids, and you'd probably never suspect anything beyond surface-level drama. In the next section, we'll look at the few people who almost bridge that gap, the ones who feel that something is wrong on a bigger scale, but still can't quite say the word Heisenberg until it's far too late. And out of all those people who almost bridge the gap, Skylar is the one who actually crosses it. She doesn't just suspect Walter White. She lives through the moment where suspicion hardens into certainty, and then, terrifyingly, into complicity. If I asked you to pinpoint the exact scene where that happens, you'd probably go to the "I am the one who knocks" speech. It's iconic, but the real shift comes a bit earlier, when Skylar confronts Walt about the money. She's done the math, the medical bills, the sudden cash, the fugue state, the second phone. In that scene, she doesn't ask if he's hiding something. She asks what he's hiding. That's level 2 suspicion turning into level 3 knowledge in real time. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Skylar is detail-oriented. She tracks receipts, questions timelines, notices that Walt's story about Elliot and Gretchen paying for treatment doesn't quite add up. But when she stands in that bedroom and says, "There's $80,000 in cash," where did it come from? She forces him into a corner. Walt does what he always does when information control fails. He pivots from lie to partial truth. "I'm in the meth business. The money is from selling meth. No more euphemisms. No more gambling cover. Just the blunt secret." So let's examine her response. because this is the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. Faced with certainty, Skylar doesn't run to Hank. She doesn't call the DIA. She buys a car wash. On paper, it's a practical decision. Launder the money, keep the family out of prison, create a plausible front. Psychologically, it's a twisted coping mechanism. Once suspicion becomes certainty, she can either collapse under the horror of who her husband is, or she can seize some control by managing the damage. She chooses control. For instance, look at how she starts rewriting her own history. She tells herself she always knew something was wrong, that on some level she saw this coming. It's a self-protective narrative, a way to avoid admitting that she ignored red flags for months. The second she agrees to help, all those earlier suspicions get retroactively reframed as signs she bravely followed rather than alarms she tried to silence. And Walt exploits that instantly. If I had to sum up his strategy here, it's simple. Shared guilt is armor. By pulling Skylar into the car wash scheme, he makes her an accomplice. Now, exposing him means exposing herself. Her incentive to go to Hank plummets, even as her fear and disgust skyrocket. He doesn't have to threaten her directly. The legal reality does it for him. Information and liability are now fused. But here's the crucial thing. The information doesn't really change from this point on. Skylar already knows he's a meth kingpin. When she finally turns against him, it won't be because she learns something new. It'll be because he crosses a moral line she can no longer pretend isn't there, and in the next section, we'll see exactly where that line is drawn. And that's exactly why the garage confrontation hits so hard. This is what it looks like when the moral line finally snaps, and suspicion becomes certainty. If I asked you to picture the moment Hank truly sees Walter White, this is the scene your brain jumps to. Hank closes the garage door, and the sound is almost a prison gate. No more barbecues, no more family small talk. Just fluorescent light, concrete, and information that can't be laughed off. He lays out Gail's notebook, the inscription, the "To my other favorite WW," clue that's been rotting in his subconscious since the bathroom. Then he does something no one else in the show really does. He says the secret out loud. He accuses Walt directly. No euphemisms, no half questions. Just, "You are Heisenberg." So let's examine Walt's response. Because if I had to sum up his strategy here in one word, it's control. He doesn't confess. He doesn't even give Hank the satisfaction of a clean denial. Instead, he immediately reframes the entire scene away from crime and toward consequence. He reminds Hank he's a dying man. He points out there's no hard proof, no witnesses, no physical link that will survive in court. The first is a plea to Hank's empathy and family loyalty. The second is a cold legal calculation. Together, they tell Hank, "You can blow up your life, but you probably won't win." This is Walt weaponizing Hank's own motivations against him. Hank lives for the badge, for the image of himself as the guy who protects his family. Walt twists that. He implies that going after him would mean public humiliation, wrecking Marie, destroying his career on what could be dismissed as a paranoid obsession. "You're not thinking straight" isn't just an insult, it's a manipulative diagnosis. He's trying to convince Hank that the more certain he feels, the less rational he must be. How many times have we seen Walt do a softer version of this with Skylar or Jesse, turning their intuition into a flaw? And then, the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation, when reframing doesn't fully work, he escalates to fear. Tread lightly. It's the moment the performance drops. Right from the beginning, the writers established Walt as someone who prefers narrative control over brute force. Here, those two finally merge. The line is both a threat and a thesis statement. I am dangerous, and you are not in control of this story anymore. What's crucial for our question is that Hank is now one of the very few characters who fully suspects Walt and is actually right. Yet even here, Walt delays consequences. Hank walks out of that garage with the truth, but also with doubt about what he can prove, what he'll lose, and what Heisenberg is capable of doing next. That hesitation is exactly the opening Walt needs. In the next section, we'll see how that opening turns into a full psychological siege, as Walt tries to turn Hank's own investigation into a weapon against him. So when Walt turns Hank's investigation into a psychological siege, there's one person he can't fully siege anymore: Jesse. Because the real endgame doesn't start in that garage. It starts in a living room, with a pack of cigarettes and a single horrifying connection snapping into place. The moment Jesse realizes the truth about Brock is one of the most brutal information reversals in the show. Huell lifts his weed, Jesse explodes, and then the pattern hits him. The missing rice and cigarette, the plant in Walt's backyard, Brock getting sick right when Walt needed Jesse to turn on Gus. If I asked you to pick the single most manipulative move in the entire series, this would be a contender. The writers don't have him say much. They let the audience watch the dawning terror on his face as he understands that poisoning a child wasn't an accident of the game. It was the game. And then the montage happens, even if it's not cut as a literal montage. In Jesse's head, every rescue scene rewinds and replays. Walt pulling him out of the crack house. Walt giving that speech about how Jane's death was for the best. Walt insisting Gail has to die. Walt comforting him after Brock recovers. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Walt always arrives at Jesse's lowest moments with the perfect script, the perfect lie, the perfect fatherly gesture. Now Jesse runs those scenes again with a new filter, Walt's self-interest. For instance, Jane's overdose is no longer a tragic coincidence. It's a decision that kept Jesse controllable. Brock's poisoning isn't a desperate move against Gus. It's leverage manufactured on the back of a little boy's life. Every time someone close to Jesse dies, Walt's power increases. That's the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. You realize the person saving you has been quietly arranging the disasters. What makes this spike of suspicion different is that it's not a hunch he can be talked out of. Earlier, Saul and Walt could drown him in explanations, in alternative stories, in just enough plausible information to smother his instincts. Here, Jesse has concrete evidence and a coherent narrative. Huel did lift the ricin. Walt did have access. Brock did get sick at the exact strategic moment. If I had to sum up Jesse's mindset in one word, it's irreversible. You can't unsee the pattern once all the scenes line up. So when he walks into Hank's office and chooses the Dia, that's not a plot twist. It's a moral breaking point. He's not flipping because he's cornered. He's flipping because he finally understands the true motivation behind every hug, every pep talk, every I'm here for you. Walt isn't a twisted father figure anymore. He's a monster who has to be stopped, even if stopping him means Jesse's own destruction. And here's the pattern interrupt. The character everyone writes off as the screw-up, the junkie, the sidekick, becomes the clearest moral and perceptual lens on who Walter White really is. While geniuses, kingpins, and Dia agents miss the full picture, it's Jesse who finally sees Heisenberg without any comforting lies left. In the next section, we'll see how Walt responds when his most important victim becomes his most dangerous witness. So when Jesse finally becomes that dangerous witness, there's one uncomfortable follow-up you can't dodge. How long did you, sitting on your couch, stay on Walt's side? If I asked you to pinpoint the exact moment you stopped rooting for him, could you actually do it? Or does it blur the same way it does for Skylar and Jesse? Because the show isn't just about Walt manipulating characters on screen. The writers are manipulating you. They are managing your moral suspicion with the same precision Walt uses in his lies. Ambitious, intelligent, desperate, relatable. If I had to sum up the way the audience is treated in one word, it would be controlled. Right from the beginning, the writers established a tight POV that glues you to Walt's perspective. You discover the secret cancer diagnosis with him. You feel the humiliation in the car wash, the raw panic in the RV, the emasculation at the family party while Hank tells Macho Dea stories. The camera hugs his face. The music swells with his fear and pride. So when he cooks meth for his family, your suspicion is preemptively softened. His crimes are framed as reactions to humiliation, not expressions of ambition. So let's examine what that does. When Walt chokes Krasny 8 with the bike lock, the scene is drenched in guilt and nausea. He makes a pros and cons list. He cries. The score leans tragic, not monstrous. The first is a murder, but it's packaged as a reluctant necessity. You're not asked, is this evil? You're asked, could you do any better in his position? That's a huge shift in motivation framing. Then come the moments where your suspicion should spike off the charts. Jane's death is the clearest. You watch Walt stand over her, see him decide, see him let her die. But the camera stays locked on his devastated face. The music plays his horror, not her terror. There's no triumphant villain cue, just this suffocating ambiguity. Was it a split-second panic? A cruel calculation? The show withholds a clear moral label, and a lot of the audience follows his own internal lie that it was an accident he couldn't stop. Brock's poisoning is the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. At first, you're in Jesse's head, suspecting Walt. Then Walt turns it, weaponizing partial information, insisting Gus did it. The truth is delayed until the lily off the valley reveal, long after you've already watched Walt win. By the time you see the plant, your outrage has to fight against the satisfaction of Gus's death. Notice the pattern. You, like Skylar and Jesse, are fed lies based on truth. You see Walt's real fear, real humiliation, real love for his kids. None of that is fake. That's exactly why it's harder to fully suspect the extent of his cruelty. The emotional evidence feels like it contradicts the moral evidence. So when we ask, how many people actually suspected Walter White? The answer quietly includes us. And the next question is harsher. How long did we choose not to see what was right in front of us? In the next section, we'll test that blindness against one final environment, the law itself, and how close Hank and the Dia really came to seeing Heisenberg at the barbecue table. And that blindness isn't just a plot device, it's psychology doing exactly what it's wired to do. If I asked you to imagine finding out your spouse, your brother-in-law, or your lab partner was a drug kingpin, your brain jumps straight to the reveal, not the months or years of ignoring the buildup. The first is much easier to picture. But in real life, the buildup is where the mind quietly edits reality, and Breaking Bad weaponizes that. So let's examine the first big culprit, normalcy bias. This is the tendency to assume that tomorrow will look like yesterday, that life will stay within familiar boundaries. It's the voice that says, Walt is stressed, not Walt is laundering cartel money. Skylar sees the second phone, the missing hours, the fugue state. Each one is an alarm bell. Yet she keeps reaching for the least catastrophic explanation. Because my husband is a manipulative meth manufacturer doesn't even feel like a real option. It feels like a movie, not a marriage. Right from the beginning, the writers established Walt as a man defined by routine, breakfast plates, school bells, car washes. That baseline of normalcy becomes psychological armor. Hank does the same thing. He can joke about Walt's mad scientist side at the bust in the desert, but the idea that this wheezing, pantsless teacher is Heisenberg simply doesn't compute. Normalcy bias keeps the theory in the realm of banter, not investigation, until the book in the bathroom rips that shield away. Layered on top of that is the halo effect. If I had to sum up this bias, it's the brain saying, he's good in this area, so he must be good in others. Walt is a loving father, a dedicated teacher, a man with cancer. Those positive traits bleed into moral judgment. Skylar can believe he's hiding gambling, not murder, because the halo of provider and victim still glows. Hank sees a meek, emasculated family man and files him under non-threat, which makes every later clue feel like an exception, not a pattern. Then you get sunk cost and emotional investment. The longer you've known someone, the more your identity is tangled with theirs, the more expensive it becomes to update your picture of who they are. Skylar isn't just protecting Walt, she's protecting the White family as an idea. To admit he's a monster is to admit her entire adult life has been built on a lie. That's not an intellectual hurdle, that's an existential cliff. Jesse's version is even more brutal. Walt arrives exactly when Jesse needs a father figure, a teacher who finally sees value in him. Walking away from that isn't just quitting a business, it's killing the story Jesse tells himself about finally being worth something. His brain keeps downgrading red flags Jane, Brock, the constant manipulation because the emotional sunk cost is enormous. Hank's macho image works the same way. He sees himself as the hunter, the protector. Admitting that Heisenberg has been sitting at his grill for years doesn't just mean I missed a suspect. It means I misjudged my own masculinity, my own competence. So his mind resists that conclusion until the evidence is literally in his hands. When you stack normalcy bias, the halo effect, and sunk cost together, Walt doesn't have to hypnotize anyone. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is simply knowing those biases exist and feeding them. He gives Skylar a story that preserves her family identity. He gives Hank a narrative that flatters his ego. He gives Jesse a role that soothes his shame. Breaking Bad isn't just plausible, it's disturbingly realistic about how human minds protect themselves from unbearable truths. The terrifying part is not that no one suspects Walter White. It's that, under the same pressures, you and I might not either. And if that's how ordinary psychology fails, what happens when you add formal systems' bad assumptions? Red tape, interagency ego. In the next section, we'll see how the law itself becomes Walt's most unintentional accomplice. So let's examine the final body count of suspicion, because this is where the show quietly becomes terrifying. If I asked you to list everyone who spends serious time with Walter White over 5 seasons, you'd get a long roster: family, colleagues, students, dealers, bosses, enemies. But if I had to sum up who truly sees him, who reaches full level 3 recognition, the number is shockingly small. The first is Skylar. She lives closest to the blast radius, but even she doesn't hit level 3 overnight. Right from the beginning, the writers established her as sharp, nosy, attuned to every small inconsistency. Second phone, fugue state, random stacks of cash. For a long time, she parks it at level 2. She knows he's lying. She knows there's serious criminal motivation, yet she still can't picture Heisenberg. It's only around the "I'm the one who knocks" era, when she sees the car wash laundering and the fear in Saul's office, that she finally understands the scale. Hank is the tragic mirror. Professionally, he's chasing Heisenberg. Personally, he's grilling with Walt. He spends years at level 2 about the abstract meth kingpin, and level 0 about his brother-in-law. The instant he reads Gail's book on the toilet, he jumps straight to level 3. There's no more ambiguity, just a horrifying click as all the past information reorders itself. Jesse, Saul, Gus, and Mike are the rest of the level 3 club. Jesse oscillates. He suspects Brock's poisoning, gets gaslit back down, then rockets to full recognition in the desert when the Risson lie collapses. Saul understands very early that Mr. White is far beyond a desperate teacher. By the time he's arranging fake identities, he's at complete awareness. Gus and Mike reach level 3 from the opposite direction. They start at level 2, clocking Walt as dangerously ambitious and manipulative. And only after the lab explosions, the cartel moves, and the Hank hit do they realize he's not just a good cook. He's a long-game predator. Level 2 is where people know there's serious crime, but not the full persona. Marie absolutely lives here. She knows about the money, the gambling cover story, the tension in every domestic scene. And she understands Walt is dirty long before she can say drug kingpin out loud. You can also slot in cartel figures who recognize there's a mystery chemist orchestrating events, but never attach a face or a mild-mannered name to Heisenberg. Level 1 is almost everyone else. Walt Jr., who reads everything as illness, pride, or divorce drama. Neighbors who see a strange man, a baby, a couple fighting in the driveway. School staff who chalk absences up to cancer and stress. Ted, who only ever reads Skylar's panic as an affair and tax fraud. Their unease never crosses the border into "this man runs an empire." And that's the point. Out of dozens of recurring characters, only 6 ever fully see him. That's how effective his information control is. So what does it mean that a man can become Heisenberg with so few level 3 witnesses, and what happens when one of those witnesses actually has institutional power and a badge? And what happens when one of those witnesses actually has institutional power and a badge? You already know the answer. Nothing good. If I asked you to point to the moment suspicion finally catches up to Walt, you wouldn't give me a scene of justice. You'd give me a body in the desert. Because the cost of not suspecting him early isn't just plot tension for the audience, it's shattered lives once the truth finally lands. Hank is the most brutal example. For seasons, his biases protect Walt. The timid chemistry teacher simply doesn't fit his mental image of a cartel player. By the time the bathroom book flips that information on its head, it's too late. The garage confrontation is electric precisely because Hank is right and powerless at the same time. His attempt to act, to reclaim control after years of being manipulated, drives him straight into the desert with Jack's crew. Suspicion arrives at level 3 just as all leverage disappears. The first is intellectual victory. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is that Walt has already arranged a world where Hank's insight can only get him killed. Skylar pays a different price. Her suspicion builds earlier, but her certainty comes late. When she finally hears "I am the one who knocks," that's not a revelation that frees her, it's a sentence. She now holds a secret she can't safely drop. For instance, the car wash scene where she whispers someone has to protect this family from the man who protects this family is not a clever line. It's a diagnosis of her trap. Her marriage is over in all but paperwork. Her moral authority with Walt Jr. is gone, and every attempt to pull away calling a lawyer, standing on that pool edge, gets folded back into Walt's narrative. If I had to sum up her late-stage life in one word, it's captivity. Jesse's realization is more interior, but no less devastating. He doesn't just suspect Walt is dangerous, he eventually understands that his entire self-image has been engineered. When he connects the rice and cigarette, Brock's poisoning, and Jane's death, the show doesn't give you a cathartic confrontation. It gives you a man screaming as he's dragged to cook for neo-Nazis. He survives, technically, but he escapes with a face permanently marked, a psyche riddled with trauma, and the knowledge that his need for validation was the lever Walt pulled again and again. Then you have Marie and Walt Jr., who never even get the slow ramp. Their suspicion is replaced by impact. One day Walt is a flawed but loving father, the next he's a confession tape and a news story. That kitchen confrontation where Walt Jr. shields Skylar with his body is what happens when you skip suspicion and jump straight to horror. So let's examine the pattern. Suspicion, as painful as it is, can be a form of protection. Early doubt gives you time to build distance, gather information, choose. Walt's true genius is that he delays that pain. He keeps everyone's mental loops closed until escape is almost impossible, then lets the truth detonate. And that raises a darker question. How exactly does he keep so many intelligent people from connecting the dots for so long? So when you ask how no one puts it together, you have to go to the one scene where Walter White finally does. Not Hank, not Skylar. Walt, the man who's been running a psychological shell game on everyone else, finally runs out of places to hide from himself. If I asked you to pick the moment the "I did it for my family" lie dies, you'd probably think of that last visit to the apartment. The camera between them. The knife on the counter. The quiet. Before that, remember his earlier phone call to Skylar after Hank's death, the one where he rants and raves to make her sound like a hostage and himself sound like a monster. On the surface, it's protection. But it's also one last performance, one last attempt to control the narrative with a calculated lie. Then, the mask slips. In that final visit, he stands there, smaller than he's ever been, and tells her what he's never admitted to anyone, including himself. I did it for me. No cancer excuse. No children. No noble sacrifice. Just ego. Pride. The thrill of being good at something. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Walt could only be this manipulative because he believed his own press release. This is the first time he tears it up. On paper, it looks like a gift to Skylar, a kind of closure. In practice, it's almost selfish in a new way. He's not freeing her, he's finally freeing his own perception from the story he's been clinging to. For years, every decision has been wrapped in the language of obligation. If I had to sum up his core motivation in that confession, it's not guilt, it's clarity. He wants, for a second, to stand in a world where he's not pretending to be the tragic provider, just the man who chose power because it felt good. So let's examine how that connects back to suspicion. The first is internal. Walt's external lies work because they're backed by internal half-truths. He really is sick. He really does love his kids. He really did get cheated out of gray matter. For instance, when he tells himself that killing Gus is necessary for his family's safety, he can sell that story to everyone else because he's already sold it to the person who matters most, his own reflection. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is what happens in that apartment. He becomes his own final suspect and his own judge. For a brief moment, he sees himself the way Hank only sees him in the garage, the way Jesse only sees him after Brock, the way Skylar only sees him standing at the edge of the pool. No more narrative loops closed, no more comforting explanation, just the raw, ugly truth that he did it because he wanted to. And once he admits that, the entire series reframes. Walter White isn't just the man who manipulated everyone around him, he's the man who weaponized a lie against himself until the evidence was so overwhelming that even Heisenberg couldn't argue with it anymore. That's where our synthesis starts. A story about a person who keeps tightening his own web of deception until there's only one mind left to conquer. That's where our synthesis starts. Once Walt finally stops lying to himself, you can suddenly see how every other manipulation was a rehearsal for that final internal con. If I asked you to map his tools, you'd see a clear progression. Secrecy at the bottom, then truth-based lies, then emotional judo, guilt, fear, ego manipulation, and finally, full information compartmentalization, sitting at the top like a crown. Right from the beginning, the writers established that Walt always starts with the lightest touch. The first is simple secrecy, not telling Skylar about the cancer, not telling Hank about the cook, not telling Jesse what the plan really is. When that cracks, he upgrades to truth-based lies. He is sick. He was with Jesse. Gretchen and Elliot did offer to help. Each lie is stitched to a real detail, so the story feels solid even as it bends reality. But when lies alone can't hold, he reaches for emotional judo. So let's examine Skylar. Every time her suspicion spikes the second phone, the fugue state, the late nights Walt doesn't just deny, he redirects. He turns her concern into an accusation of mistrust, then into guilt for not supporting a dying husband. Once she's trapped in that emotional frame, he can drop the gambling cover story as a relief valve. Her mind wants the loop closed, so she accepts the lesser evil. With Hank, the latter looks different, but the structure is the same. At first, Hank's biases do half the work. He simply can't see his nerdy brother-in-law as a kingpin. When the Heisenberg investigation gets hot, Walt escalates. Fake phone calls about Marie in the hospital, the staged breakdown in the desert, the car crash that derails Hank's pursuit, each is a step up in aggression. When suspicion climbs, Walt doesn't run. He pushes it back down the ladder with fear, guilt, and carefully rationed information. Jesse shows you the darkest version. For instance, when Jesse suspects Brock was poisoned, Walt doesn't just lie. He rewrites Jesse's entire emotional reality. He weaponizes their shared history, plays the betrayed father figure, and redirects Jesse's rage toward Gus. That's the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. He's no longer managing facts. He's editing Jesse's perception of who is good and who is evil. If I had to sum up Walt's transformation, it isn't that he becomes Heisenberg by cooking meth. He becomes Heisenberg by learning to rewrite reality in the minds of everyone around him, until the world they see is the one that best serves his motivation in that moment. Breaking Bad then plays like a long psychological experiment. How far can one person go if they're willing to control not just actions but perceptions? And how few people will truly see them for what they are until it's far too late. In the next section, we're going to test that question character by character and count who actually suspected Walter White and who never even came close. And here's where it gets uncomfortable. Because while we're busy judging all these characters for missing the obvious, the show is quietly asking you to admit something else. You didn't really want them to see Walter White clearly. Not at first. You wanted the illusion to hold, because watching him get away with it is part of the thrill. If I asked you to explain why you kept watching Walt, you'd probably talk about the tension, the danger, the moral spiral. But if I had to sum up a huge chunk of the appeal in one word, it would be power. You're watching a man who starts as a powerless high school teacher suddenly gain control over every room he walks into, not by being the strongest, but by being the most manipulative person there. That's a dark kind of wish fulfillment. The fantasy isn't just being rich, it's being untouchable. So let's examine how that plays out on your side of the screen. When Walt walks into Tuco's office with fulminated mercury and blows out the windows, the scene is terrifying, but it's also staged like a victory. The writers give you the rhythm of a win. You're meant to feel the release. You know he's a criminal, but the show leans on your instinct to cheer when the protagonist outsmarts the bigger monster. That's exactly how Jesse keeps forgiving him and how Hank keeps underestimating him. They're drawn to the apparent competence, the illusion of certainty. The discomfort is that you feel that same pull. You're impressed by the fugue state lie, by the fake gambling addiction, by the way he flips information on Skylar or the Dia and walks away looking honest. Even when the people he's tricking are closer to the moral right than he is, the structure of the scene nudges you to applaud the move. When he frames Gale's death as necessary, a part of the audience goes along, at least for a moment, because the narrative has trained you to prioritize Walt's survival. The first is complicity in the manipulation itself. You're not just observing his tactics, you're participating. You know more secrets than any character on screen, and yet you still get blindsided by turns like the Brock poisoning. That's the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation, realizing that Walt isn't only gaslighting Skylar and Jesse, he's controlling your emotional reactions too. And that's the final proof. His tools aren't just fictional tricks, they're built on real psychological dynamics. Charisma, framing, selective information, the comfort of a closed loop. If a TV character can bend your sympathies, how confident are you that a real-life Walter White wouldn't do the same? As we go character by character next, keep that in mind. We're not just counting who suspected him. We're testing how easily perception can be managed, including yours. So let's examine one more twist in how you watch this show. Up to now, you've probably treated Breaking Bad as a crime saga, rise, empire, downfall. But if I asked you to re-watch it with a different thesis, try this. Imagine it as a 5-season experiment in suspicion. Who notices what, when, and how fast does Walter White shut that suspicion down? If I had to sum up this lens in one word, it's timing. Every character is on their own delay. Skyler is early on the inconsistencies but late on the scale. Hank is early on Heisenberg but late on the backyard cook. Jesse is early on Walt's capacity for violence but late on just how personal that violence can be. On rewatch, you're not just tracking crimes, you're tracking hesitation, eye contact, those half-second pauses where the brain says, hold on, and the heart says, no, that's Walt. He's safe. Treat those micro-moments like data points. When Hank jokes about Walt's mad scientist side after the early meth lab bust, freeze that scene in your mind. The information is there. The DIA has the RV description, the blue product, the geography. The audience knows the answer. Hank laughs, looks at Walt, then looks away. That tiny look away is the entire show's psychology in one beat. Suspicion flickers, then social roles and prior assumptions take back control. Right from the beginning, the writers establish this pattern. Skyler's frown when Walt disappears during the fugue state. Marie's sideways glance when the gambling story gets too polished. Jesse staring at Walt after Brock's poisoning, convinced, then unconvinced, then convinced again. On a rewatch, you can run a mental counter. Every time someone pauses around Walt, ask yourself, what exact lie, what exact secret, what exact emotional hook is about to smother that spark? Pay special attention to the throwaway lines and jokes about Walt being passive, harmless, the high school teacher. Those are almost all near misses. A student laughs about Mr. White being too square to break a rule. Hank calls him Einstein in that condescending brother-in-law tone. For instance, when Skyler tells him, you're not a criminal, early on, it sounds supportive, but it's actually the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation. Walt hears the limit of her imagination and builds his cover story right up to that line, but never across. Viewed this way, the show becomes more tense, not less, because you know exactly how much danger everyone is in and exactly how close they are to seeing it. The garage confrontation with Hank stops being a surprise twist and becomes the overdue moment when all those ignored micro-suspicions finally collide with undeniable evidence. So as we go character by character next, that's your challenge. When did each one truly suspect Walter White? And what does the delay say about them? And about you? So let's turn that spotlight around for a second, because it's one thing to track Skyler's hesitation or Hank's blind spots, but the more uncomfortable question is this. When did you stop rooting for Walter White and start suspecting him as an actual villain? If I asked you to pause the show at the exact frame where your sympathy broke, what scene would it be? Was it early, when he lets Crazy 8 go on and on about his family, collects all that personal information, and then still strangles him in the basement? Or did you hold out until Jane's overdose, where he watches her die, does nothing, and then has the nerve to act like Jesse's grieving father afterward? That's not just desperate. If I had to sum up that version of Walt in one word, it's calculated. So let's examine your timeline next to the characters you've been judging. Were you faster than Skyler, who senses the second phone, the fugue state, the gambling lie, but keeps trying to fit it into a good husband with secrets narrative? Did you suspect Walt's true nature before Hank, who literally jokes about Walt's mad scientist side at the season 1 bust and still eats ribs with Heisenberg every weekend? Or were you slower than Jesse, who looks at the rice and cigarette, looks at Brock, looks at Walt, and finally sees the monster he's been making excuses for since the RV days? The first is comparison. Put your own suspicion curve right next to theirs. Did you already think he was irredeemable while Walt Jr. was still idolizing his dad, the fighter? Did you hang on longer than Marie, who doesn't know details but can feel the emotional rot from across the room? Those gaps are not random. They reveal what kind of manipulation you're most willing to forgive. And don't just stick to the main four. In the comments, call out the side character moments that you think are early alarm bells the show buries under plot. For instance, Saul's instant instinct to ask, "Did you bring a gun to my office?" the first time he meets Walt. Or Mike's "Dead Aid, I've known guys like you" speech in the bar. Right from the beginning, the writers established that people on the criminal side read his motivation differently than his family does. But even they underestimate how far he'll go. Here's the real challenge. When you explain your moment, also explain your excuse. What made you hold off? Was it the cancer? The humiliation at the car wash? The need to believe this character was still salvageable? The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is realizing that when you excuse him, you're revealing your own weak spots for control in real life. Use the comment section as a collective map. Pin your episode, your scene, your breaking point. Because once we see where the audience finally suspects Walter White, we can measure just how invisible he really was. And here's where this stops being just about Walter White and starts being about you. Because if I asked you to right now name the Walter in your own life, you'd probably say you don't have one. That's the same confidence every character has in the show, right up until the truth detonates. Real life isn't a TV show. There are no dramatic cutaways, no ominous music when someone lies to you. But the cognitive machinery that protects Walt from suspicion, that is absolutely real. The first is normalcy bias, the brain's lazy habit of assuming that because things have always been fine, they still are. Skylar sleeps next to a drug kingpin and keeps telling herself he's just stressed. Hank barbecues with Heisenberg because Walt is a harmless chemistry teacher in his mental file system. Then you get the halo effect. Once you've filed someone as a good dad, loyal friend, or smart professional, their future behavior gets graded on a curve. For instance, Walt Jr. doesn't just miss the red flags, he actively defends his father against them, because the image of Dad the hero is psychologically safer than Dad the monster. You do this too, with partners, bosses, even influencers you like. You round off the sharp edges to keep the picture intact. And underneath all of that is sunk cost. Skylar has years of marriage, a child, a house, a whole identity tied to Walt. Admitting who he really is would mean admitting her entire life story is built on a lie. That's not just painful, that's existential. So she delays, rationalizes, collaborates. The audience screams at her. But in real life, people cling to bad narratives because they've invested too much in them. So let's examine what you can actually do with this, without becoming paranoid. Start with two brutally simple questions. 1. What evidence would change my mind about this person? If your honest answer is nothing, that's not loyalty, that's blindness. 2. Am I ignoring red flags because of how much I need this relationship to be safe? That's exactly the trap that keeps Jesse walking back into Walt's orbit, long after the poison and the betrayals. Suspicion doesn't mean you start treating everyone like they're Heisenberg. It means you're willing to update your picture of someone when new information demands it. Almost no one does that with Walt until it's far too late. Hank literally needs a book with a handwritten dedication to crash through years of jokes, beers, and family dinners. If I had to sum up Breaking Bad as a psychological lesson, it's a cautionary tale about the cost of refusing to see what's right in front of you. The writers weaponize your own biases as an audience, the same way Walt weaponizes information in every scene. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation, in the real world, is gentle skepticism, quietly questioning the narratives people sell you, including the flattering ones about yourself. Because if Walt can hide in plain sight on screen, what does that say about who can hide in plain sight off screen? So if Walt can hide in plain sight on screen, the uncomfortable punchline is simple. Almost no one in his world really sees him either. 5 seasons, dozens of characters, an entire city under the shadow of blue meth, and if I had to sum up the central answer in one sentence, it's this. Only a tiny circle ever truly suspects that Walter White is Heisenberg, and nearly every one of them pays for that clarity with their life, their freedom, or their sanity. Think about the roll call. Hank finally connects the dots in a garage and ends up buried in the desert. Jane spots Walt's manipulative streak in a single hospital scene and dies on her back in bed. Gus reads the arrogance behind the chemistry and is blown in half. Jesse, the closest witness, cycles through suspicion about the ricin, the call to Brock's hospital, the convenient timing of every disaster, and when he finally stops letting Walt rewrite his memory, he's chained like an animal under neo-Nazis. The show repeatedly punishes accurate perception. So let's examine why so few people get there. Walter's real genius isn't just in chemistry, it's in psychological control. He doesn't only cook meth, he cooks belief. He tracks information like a scientist, turning every secret, every half-truth, every staged breakdown into a controlled experiment on the people around him. For instance, he gives Hank just enough of the anxious, emasculated brother-in-law performance that Hank's ego fills in the rest. He gives Skylar just enough "I'm scared of cancer" that she builds an entire gambling addiction narrative for him. He lets the criminal underworld think he's either a harmless amateur or an inscrutable mastermind, depending on what keeps him safest that week. The irony is brutal. This is a man whose core motivation is to be seen as powerful. If I asked you to describe his fantasy, it's not a quiet life. It's respect, fear, legacy. Yet right from the beginning, the writers establish that his strategy is the opposite of visibility. He hides behind coughing fits, beige clothes, missed calls, the persona of a man too weak and too boring to be a threat. The first is the mild-mannered chemistry teacher. The next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is the myth of Heisenberg, and he keeps them in separate boxes as long as he can. And then you get that late series image, Walt walking through his empty house, Heisenberg sprayed across the wall, the pool drained, windows shattered, yellow tape flapping. For years, his home was the perfect camouflage, the stage for barbecues with the Dia, family dinners, fake interventions. Now, it's a monument to exposure. The second everyone finally sees him, everything collapses at once. No more plausible deniability. No more weak man mask. Just a hollow shell where the performance used to live. So as we close the file on Heisenberg, the real question is not just how many people suspected Walter White, but how often you let yourself be manipulated in the same way. In the next section, you'll keep digging into the psychology of Breaking Bad and, if you're honest, into the parts of yourself that rooted for him, excused him, or never quite wanted to see him clearly either. So now that you've tracked Walt's trail of suspicion through the whole show, this is where you turn from passive audience to active investigator. If I asked you to map out a suspicion timeline, not for Walt, but for everyone around him, what would it look like? Where does Skylar's first flicker of doubt go on your chart? And when does it finally harden into certainty? In the comments, build that timeline. The first is Skylar. Do you mark it at the second cell phone fight, the fugue state, or the gambling confession scene where she realizes the lie is too polished to be spontaneous? Then Hank. Is it the early mad scientist jokes, the Heisenberg case file spread across his desk, or only the bathroom revelation with the book that truly flips the switch for you? And Jesse, at what point do you think he really knows Brock's poisoning, the missing ricin, or that final devastating realization in the living room before he turns on Walt for good? Now take it one step further and put yourself on that same chart. If I had to sum up the hidden thesis of this whole video in one line, it's that your brain is just as vulnerable to information control as any Breaking Bad character. So let's examine your own viewing history. When did you personally start to suspect Walt was irredeemable? Was it Crazy 8, Jane, Brock, or Hank? Drop that moment below and explain which scene finally broke through your own denial. To really test your suspicion scale, re-watch the key pressure points. Go back to the second cell phone argument and watch how calmly Walt shifts from cornered to offended. How he gaslights Skylar until she doubts her own perfectly reasonable instincts. Revisit the Brock poisoning arc and track every tiny beat where Jesse's intuition spikes, then gets smothered by Walt's performance. Then hit the bathroom revelation again, and notice how right from the beginning the writers established the book as a harmless gift, only to weaponize it seasons later as the most brutal of course in television history. If this kind of manipulative character autopsy is your thing, subscribe. This channel is built as a hub for breaking down control, secrets, lies, and motivation across the shows and films you already obsess over. From gaslighting and family dramas to criminal masterminds who never touch a weapon, the next step on the sinister ladder of manipulation is just lining them up and seeing who's really pulling the strings. For instance, if you want to see the opposite style of control, cue up the Gus Fring deep dive next, or jump into the playlist on Jesse's moral arc and watch how a victim of manipulation slowly, painfully rebuilds a conscience. If Walter White could hide in plain sight for 5 seasons, imagine who you're not suspecting yet and what they're getting away with while you're still cheering them on.